So a very good evening. Time for the press preview. It's our first look at tomorrow's front pages and checking out the headlines with me tonight. Pippa Crerar, political editor at The Guardian, and Harry Cole, political editor at The Sun. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Very good evening to you. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at some of those front pages, beginning with tomorrow's Metro, leading with the King saying, "I lost my sense of taste." The Financial Times leads with a story about the takeover proposal between two titans of the global mining industry. The Guardian's top headline, a Labour-commissioned report calls for rent caps to tackle the housing crisis. While tomorrow's Daily Telegraph leads with China's reaction to three people who were arrested in the UK charged with spying for Hong Kong. The Daily Mail leads with claims that Ozempic slashes heart attack and stroke risk. And the Times has more on that story. Weight loss jab reduces heart deaths by a fifth. While the Daily Express also leads on the jab, hailed as a new statin cutting weight and saving lives. While the Mirror features a story about how families of FA Cup players face having to pay their own way to watch the final as the club axes perks to cut costs. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code you see on screen during the programme. Have a look at the front pages while you watch all of us discussing them. And to do that, Pippa Crerar, political editor at The Guardian, and Harry Cole, political editor at The Sun. Great to see you this Monday evening. Hi. In fact, pretty much all the papers have got this remarkable health story on the front. So let's begin with the Times. Pippa, weight loss jab reduces heart deaths by a fifth, and this could potentially help millions of people.
Yeah, it's a good news health story, and I think because of that, and because it's obviously quite consumery, and because of the fact, if you look at all the bylines on the Times, the Express, the Mail and others, there's a health conference in Venice, not normally health editors are based in the UK.
They seem to have a nice jolly, aren't they?
There's a study, I mean, I wouldn't want to say, but there's a study which has been carried out by a professor called John Deanfield of UCL, which he has published at this conference. And that, I think, is why it's had so much attention. But the findings are quite dramatic. And, you know, as you say, potentially millions of middle-aged Britons could end up being prescribed weight loss injections to cut their risk of heart attack and stroke by 20%, which is, you know, a substantial reduction. And this is a study into the weight loss drug Ozempic, which is more commonly known as in Hollywood and amongst celebrities to help them lose a few
commonly known
pounds.
as the Sun as the fat jab, yeah.
To lose a few pounds here or there, but this suggestion is that actually it could become something which is prescribed much more widely. Obviously, we, like many other Western nations, have an obesity crisis, and the suggestion here is that while it has previously been prescribed or used to treat conditions like obesity and diabetes, so approved for those conditions, this actually would extend it beyond that to cardiac and to heart attacks and strokes, which is a big deal. I
mean, it is a big deal. Front page of the Daily Express as well. Game-changing is how they describe it. And the trial was a big one, wasn't it? 17,604 adults over the age of 45 who had heart disease. And it is a condition that affects more than 7 million British people.
That's the thing. We've read a lot about this drug. It's been on trend, as people said, in Hollywood, and we've read a lot about its dramatic weight loss implications. What we haven't known and hasn't really been around long enough was to know the sort of longer-term impacts of it, negative. I mean, there are questions around long-term use, but also, and now we're seeing the positives. So I think the more we find out about this drug, the more it's sort of. I remember when it was given the green light in the UK, it was sort of hailed again in a similar number of front pages and good news stories for one angle, but it seems to be a drug that keeps on giving, and the Danish company that are making this. I think Rishi Sunak in his speech today cited the fact they've put on points on their GDP because of this onto the Danish GDP because of the success of this drug.
I'm quite Puritan about these things, and I kind of think that the best way still to lose weight is to eat less and exercise more. But it is certainly the case that we, as a nation, it's not just Britain, of course, it's the Western world, have got actually quite lazy about this as well. And if there is the option of using this to not just to lose weight, but also potentially to have a serious impact on your
And also,
your health
you have to wonder whether
chances.
the decline in heart disease and the risk of heart attacks and strokes is because you've lost weight. Are you at a higher risk because if you are larger and obese,
that's a good point.
you are a much...
And all the
or is it that-
participants in the trial were overweight or obese as well.
Yeah.
So.
I wonder if all those health correspondents in Venice are eating pizza.
Knocking back a few glasses of red wine. That's good for the heart, isn't it?
Cooking up tomorrow's front pages for us. They don't get out much. It's nice to see them. It's nice to see them on the front for once.
It is. Let's move on to politics then. Looking in the Times, they've gone for Labour can't stand up to Putin and China like I can, says Sunak. Harry, can Labour be trusted with the nation's security, do you think? Because Rishi Sunak doubts it.
This is always a sort of comfort zone, I think, that the Conservative parties revert to. Every election going, there's always gone for, national security. If you look at some polls, not all of them, and it's not always close, it is one of the few remaining areas where the Tories are still just about outpoll the Labour Party on whether the public trust them. They've lost the economy, they've lost control of the borders, they're behind on the NHS. Defence, it feels like Rishi feels like he's on comfortable ground, I think. Obviously, Keir Starmer isn't as easy a target to paint as, Jeremy Corbyn abolished the army, calling Hamas friends, going for takeaways with terrorists around the world. That was sort of manna from heaven for the Tories in 2019, especially post-Skripal, where he'd sort of been very dubious on that. It's a much harder sell on Keir Starmer. That said, Rishi Sunak gave a pretty good go today. It was a quite strange speech because he went from he opened up by saying, we've never been more close to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and these crinks, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, this new sort of axis and this new enemy that we're facing, is all... And then he sort of tried to end the speech on a sort of note of optimism, but everything's going to be OK if you stick with me. And it was a bit of a mess, but you can see the dividing lines being sort of painted in very sort of primary colours. Whether or not it will work remains to be seen, but, there is big questions on defence, on the borders and on the economy that Labour still haven't answered, really. They're talking big picture, but I think what we'll see in the coming weeks and months is an attempt to pin Starmer down on those issues.
Yeah, because he's been quite vague, hasn't he? Especially when it talks about defence spending, and we know that the Tories have said, by 2030, 2.5% of GDP, whereas Labour has been quite vague on this, just when conditions allow.
Well, I'm coming back to how Harry was saying about it being a slightly strange speech. I actually thought it was all over the place. And I thought that he was leaping around. One minute it was like nuclear threat, and the next minute it was smoking. And, you weren't quite sure which direction he was going to go to next. And, both the Times and The Sun writing this up as, the quoting Rishi Sunak as Keir Starmer as a national security threat. This is actually, I think, quite desperate tactics. This is the sort of headline you normally see in the final weeks before a general election.
Well, maybe we are in the final weeks of the general election.
We may be.
He wouldn't rule out July, and I walked out of that speech thinking, that is exactly the sort of speech you hear when you're about to push the button.
But it was an attack. It was attack lines. It was an attack speech.
The nuclear button, the election.
The election button.
Exactly. And when you're asking about Labour and what they had set out. So the three areas of security that this speech was about, when he wasn't diverging off into talking about trans rights or smoking or maths at 18, were security, national security, economic security and the security of our borders. And if you take national security and defence, as Harry rightly says, Keir Starmer is a harder target for the government, for the Tories, than Jeremy Corbyn was.
Yeah.
But Labour is still pretty nervous about... and work very hard to kind of, have Starmer
rightly so. They've got a lot of work to do. They've got a lot of work to do on that.
And to try and show that they're a changed Labour Party. But, the 2.5% commitment, just taking the defence aspect of it, which by 2030, which Sunak announced on a trip that I was on a couple of weeks ago to Poland, Labour had called for a 2.5% of GDP commitment for defence on the 12th of April on a trip to Barrow. in the northwest. What they didn't do is put a timeline on it. What they said that they would do is when the economy could sustain it, could afford it. And by resisting putting a timescale on it now, because they argue they don't know what the situation is going to be that they inherit economically, they feel that that's created a dividing line for the Tories. The other one, obviously, of course, is on border security. And Sunak's had a bit of a blow. I mean, it could yet go either way, the Natalie Elphicke defection. But, this is the MP for Dover, and they felt that the MP for Dover, who was actually pretty right-wing on migration, defecting to the Labour Party, showed people, this is their argument, shows people that not only that can Labour win anywhere in the country, as the local elections suggested, but also that they can win with any type of voter. And it's kind of like a message to people
it's got to be credible, though. It's got to be believable.
And saying come to Labour instead.
It's got to be believable, and everyone's looked at that and gone, nah. I mean, even Labour's MPs have looked at that and gone, this is nonsense. This is about, short-term political wins and headlines at PMQs rather than actually... What was the great, fantastic line, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, from Neil Kinnock, who said the Labour Party's a broad church, but even churches have wars.
That's right.
Which I just sort of summed up some of the mood anyway. But the Labour do have a lot to do. They do have a lot of movements to do. At the end of the day, I know it's, it was, 5 years ago in British politics, seems like a very long time. Keir Starmer was saying make Jeremy Corbyn the Prime Minister. He was one of those people that sat...
Well, half the cabinet rode in behind Liz Truss.
Yeah, but I mean, Liz Truss is not, is not cozying up to terrorists.
Well, she crashed the economy.
Oh, come on. You cannot compare the long history of anti-British sentiment, actions and dangerous politics of Jeremy Corbyn to a politician who you disagree with on economic... I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was, the fact that they were even willing to contemplate putting it into number 10 remains terrifying. And, the media...
I don't think they thought he could win,
in
actually.
Westminster have sort of moved on from it. But I think in the public's mind,
Do you know what?
I think they still remember it.
Yeah, do you know, we're going to have to move on from it as well. It's time.
We're going to be arguing about this for
I know you are. You can carry on during the ads. More stories we'll be discussing include this on the front of The Guardian. Its headline, Labour report calls for rent caps to tackle the growing housing crisis. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. Pippa and Harry are still with me. Front of the Daily Telegraph, Pippa. This is interesting. Officials accused of infiltrating the border force and the police to spy for Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And it's the latest in a line of Chinese attacks or infiltrations of the UK. Obviously, recently we had the hack of the Ministry of Defence database. The salary details and so on. And now we have a border force officer and a Home Office immigration official among 3 people charged with spying for Hong Kong. You'll remember, of course, that there was a big crackdown by China on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong in 2019. And ever since then, there's been concerns that Beijing has been harassing dissidents in the UK. The UK government gave 3 million Hong Kong residents the right to move to the UK permanently. In 2020. So, a huge number of people, 125,000, I think, have come over and entered the UK since then. Huge migrant wave. But these 3 individuals, it's particularly worrying because obviously they're working for Border Force and for the Home Office's own enforcement system. And the Home Office has ordered a review of recruitment, vetting and supervision procedures in the wake of this police investigation. But the mind boggles a bit as to what sort of information they potentially could have access to. Yeah,
what we're saying, in the last few months, we've noticed an increase in number of people being arrested and called out for this stuff. There was a decision made about 2.5 years ago at sort of national security level of, right, we are going to start escalating, like, we're not going to take this anymore. Perhaps knowing that people were, meddling in our country, there was a decision to escalate it. The National Security Act was passed last year, which made it easier to detain people. And this is what we're seeing. The evidence threshold is much lower for arrest now.
Yeah, allegations, of course.
Allegations as they stand. But what I would say is that there's something very wrong gone on at Border Force here. I mean, former Border Force chief executives and the like have heads have rolled for much less than this. And if there was, if these 3 were, if these 2 were involved in Border Force, we need to have a proper root and branch look at who else is in there. And then you look at the motivations of it. Was it cash? Was it ideology? Was it a bit of both? What's, who? if that is what's happening, if it's a systematic infiltration of our borders.
Yes, I mean
another
court case ongoing. So
court case
be very
ongoing,
careful.
but an absolute whopper on the Home Secretary's desk again.
I'm going to move on just because we've only got 1 minute left, and I want Pippa to just tell us about this on the front of your paper.
So this is very quickly, this is a report that was commissioned by Lisa Nandy when she was Shadow Housing Secretary. Obviously, she's not in that job anymore, but the report was carried out by a Labour council leader into rent caps, actually into the whole housing market. But one of the recommendations that the report makes is about capping rent rises. It's not a rent freeze, and which of course economists have warned could damage the supply in the housing market. But what the suggestion is that when people are renewing tenancies, the rises could be capped at either inflation or at local wage growth, whichever of those is the lower. And the report also recommends rent review, that raising rents mid-tenancy could be banned, and that rent increases could only happen once a year with 4 months' notice to tenant. Those last 2 points are both in the government's renters reform.
Yeah,
I mean, slightly different.
That's less controversial than the first.
But Labour has been clear that this is an independent report. They're saying that they're not having a shadow,
think you're going to see that headline on
cabinet minister at the launch. This is a recommendation made to them. Obviously, put Stammer under pressure on some of these issues.
We can perhaps delve into this a bit more in the next hour.
Of course,
We're going to have to leave it there.